Many people have gone or plan to go somewhere to seek deeper connection and enlightenment. But what are the dangers to be conscious of before taking such a trip? Today's guest is Caroline Slaughter. Caroline is a filmmaker and global voiceover talent. Most recently, she was supervising producer on Racket, Inside the Gold Club, which was ranked as one of 2020's best true crime podcasts. Caroline's multifaceted experience in the entertainment industry has prepared her for the role of curating auditory stories to provoke, impact, and entertain. She is the host of the popular Astray Podcast, where she investigates those who pay the ultimate cost in search for spiritual awakening. I'm your host, Chris Parker, and this is the Easy Pray Podcast. Caroline, thank you for coming on the Easy Pray Podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
So can you give me a little bit of background on why you started the widely popular Astray Podcast?
I started it because I really wanted to look at this idea of power and the spiritual industry specifically. And it led me to stories about these men, these various Westerners that came from, Ireland, Australia, the States, who went to India seeking spirituality and then disappeared. And so I was interested in what happened to them and sort of looking at the broader question of what is the cost of enlightenment.
That's amazing. Like, I've always heard stories of guys saying, I'm gonna go off to India and learn from a yogi, and I kind of wonder, like, what kind of vetting process did you do? Like, how did you decide that particular guy?
Yeah, I think there needs to be more of a vetting process in the whole sort of $4.5 billion spiritual industry, because people really are looking outside themselves for deeper answers and to sort of their identity and purpose. And if we don't know who's leading us, in these quests, then it leads to some dangerous situations.
Yeah, I can totally imagine, particularly with the pandemic kind of loosening up and a lot of people having been home alone and isolated, they're kind of looking to explore who they are and trying to find meaning. And seeking enlightenment, whether it's in India or some other country or even locally, I can see that draw of that industry and that kind of that environment where people are just looking for something.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, we were able to debunk this idea of India syndrome, which is a psychosis that hits people from, developed Western countries who are looking for a cultural space to sort of find themselves or to find the spiritual sustenance. We debunked that because it's not just India. It's like you said, it's anywhere. It's in the States. It's, it's in Bali. So I just feel like that's one thing I wanted to debunk in Astray. But that being said, India has this rich spiritual history, and people go there looking for something more. But to your point about sort of people after the pandemic coming out and looking for answers, yes, and looking for purpose, yes. And I have been talking to a lot of people who've done similar podcasts around cults, and they think that cults are going to boom after this, which is really interesting. And scary.
Yeah, very. So how do people end up, with the people that you've interviewed and the stories that you've told, how do people end up choosing what country they go to, or is it just kind of this random process?
I think, I can speak for myself. I sort of chose Bali as a place to seek when I was going through, I think this happens a lot of times when people are seeking, they're going through a rock bottom or a transition in their life. They've gone through a breakup, they've had a loss, a death, whatever it might be. They're looking for something more. I chose to go to Bali. Thankfully, I had people that I knew there. I had people that I spoke to before I went that sort of knew the lay of the land and people that I should contact. So I was prepared before I went. But I do think a lot of people, and this is sort of what I discovered through doing Astray, they don't really go in prepared. They don't go in with a buddy. They don't. And so they're sort of open for scams or, sort of people preying on them, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting that you say that it is so consistent even with intentional fraud. And let's assume that some of the enlightenment is not intentionally fraudulent, but with a lot of the scams and fraud, it's about finding people that are alone, finding people that are isolated, and
Hmm.
exploiting that isolatedness, that isolation.
I'm sure you've seen that in a lot of the podcasts that you do, just on that sort of predatory behavior. It is finding people that are, yeah, seeking connection. Um, but it is, I wonder how we're going to be able to handle that with people coming out of the pandemic, like being able to create connection without them losing themselves, if that makes sense, without them giving their power away.
Well, and that kind of makes, like, to me, I think this is a very Western, coming from a very very Western viewpoint, is that if we're looking to Asia, India, which is okay, it's part of Asia, but Asian cultures, Indian cultures, I think we look to that because it's so fundamentally different. It's has a diversity and a history that we don't necessarily have, or at least that we don't have familiarity with.
Yes.
And that kind of makes me wonder if that's some of the draw, is that maybe, hey, we've only been around a couple hundred years as a country. What has this culture learned that we haven't been able to figure out?
Or like, what have they not adopted? Like we've gotten lost in our in our iPhones and in this idea of this Western idea of having to work consistently and like live to work. And I think that they've done something right in that. I don't know, like in India, from what I've sort of gathered, is that they value more of that connection, and they value a connection to a higher power, whatever that might be. And also just the lineage of religion there and spirituality. And you can just, from what I've heard, like I was supposed to go to India for this podcast, but COVID hit, so I couldn't. But from what I've heard from my counterpart was over there, Ankita Anand, who's an investigative journalist, is in India. And, it's just, it resonates with something that feels, I don't know, almost fulfilling for those that are spiritually seeking.
Something deeper, something bigger.
Yes, something powerful. Um, and I think that's sort of what leads to, just from speaking to this one guy who sort of came out of the woodwork during Astray, which Charlie Marinelli is his name. I had covered 3 stories at that time: Ryan Chambers, Justin Alexander Shetler, and Jonathan Spallan's stories about going to India and disappearing. And then I get an email from this guy who said, I would have been just like them if my parents hadn't come to find me in
Wow.
India. And basically, episode 7 of Astray is his parents like having this crazy thrill ride trying to find their son who had had a psychotic break over there. And I think, from talking to Charlie, like he went there because he was looking for the next level of his spiritual growth. And he thought that India was the place to do that. It's almost like K2 if you're a mountain climber. It's like that's India for spiritual seekers.
Yeah. So is there, I'm trying to think of, for people who are seeking enlightenment and seeking to take things deeper, where are they going? I don't want to say where are they going wrong, but what are they missing that's leading them to disappear or to be taken advantage of?
Well, I talked to this woman. Her name is Susie Singh. She's a therapist, and she works around a lot of this idea of enlightenment. And I asked her opinion in episode 9, and she basically said what they're sort of doing wrong is they're looking outside themselves for answers, and they're giving, and like I said earlier, they're giving their power away to these gurus or to these yoga ashrams. And she made a really good point with a teacher that she had where he said, I can open the window and point you to the moon, but I cannot get you there. You will have to make that journey yourself. And I say that only because I think a lot of teachers say, I will show you the moon, I will lead you there, and then you will give me everything that I have given you. Like there's almost this we've seen it with Nexium, which is a great example of this cult that gave people really like tools that they could use in their life and that made them happier and clearer in their life. But then those tools were used against them. And then, they found themselves in this cult where they had totally lost their identity. And so I think that's what I, started to sort of see with it's this idea of I'm looking outside myself for something. I trust this. I'm going to try this. And they take it a step too far. Like Justin Alexander Shetler, he was episode 3, he trusted a bad sadhu, which is a guru, like a holy man, basically. I shouldn't say it's a guru. Sorry, it's a sadhu is a holy man in India. And he trusted this guy, and this guy was going to show him like the fast track to enlightenment. And Justin ended up dying in that process. That's alleged. We don't know for sure, but that's pretty much it. And then, another Ryan Chambers was the first 2 episodes, and his parents and brother have come to believe that it was his anti-malarial drug that he was taking that caused this sort of psychotic break. And when I went down this research hole around this, like, this is very true for the malarial drug that he was using, that it causes these hallucinations and this sort of mania. And so, there was all these reasonings behind it. Unfortunately, there's no real answer. And that's why Charlie Marinelli's story was so interesting. Someone who's actually lived it and then survived it. And we found out with him that he doesn't know for sure, but he's pretty sure he was being drugged by the guru that he was working with to get to this higher form of spirituality.
Was it that, like, from his recollection, was it that that it was malicious, or it was just, this is just part of the process and that is one of the potential outcomes?
It's a really hard question, because I spoke to another woman who had a similar psychotic break to Charlie, and she said something to me that really stuck out. She said, "This didn't happen to me, it happened for me." She feels like this psychotic break that she had in India almost gave her more insight in her life. It made her see things differently. It gave her a new perspective. And it's given her, I don't know. So all of that to say, I don't know if he goes back and forth. He doesn't want to think it was malicious. He wants to think this guy really wanted to help him reach this higher form of enlightenment. But then when we really look at it, and when I've sort of had to play devil's advocate, I'm like, look, this guy was drugging you. You didn't know that this was in whatever you were drinking or eating. So I have to see it as malicious, but I don't know if Charlie will totally see it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it makes me wonder, like, if some of this is, like you said, trying to fast track enlightenment. That
Sure.
Everybody has a journey that they're on, and I think particularly as Westerners, we like, well, I want it and I want it now.
Mm-hmm,
and so, what can I do I want to remove all the hard work, and I just want the answer. I just want the enlightenment, and enlighten me now. And it's like, well, well, if you want it under those conditions, this is your only option.
Right. Well, it's interesting, too, because Susie Singh, that therapist, and she's from Delhi. She's an Indian woman, and she has such an interesting viewpoint on all this. But she said that fast track to enlightenment, that's addiction. That's not enlightenment. That's not spirituality. Spirituality is about doing deeper work. And, that's the work that all of us sort of don't want to look at, our relationship with our parents, or, like whatever it might be, joining a recovery group, whatever. And I think she keeps people are like going to these places to sort of find enlightenment during rock bottom times. And they're looking for the fast track because they don't really want to sit with their own feelings. And I think that's what we're finding with COVID as well. People had to sit with their shit for a long time, and coming out of it, they want, either answers or a way to heal this. And it's not going to be a fast track. As she said, that's an addiction. That's not spirituality.
Yeah, because I think of, my uneducated viewpoint on the topic is that when I think of monks or gurus, I think of people that they have figured out what they have figured out over a course of a lifetime. Mm-hmm. And me knocking on their front door and saying, hey, can you distill your lifetime of experiences down to, a 40-hour session?
Yeah, exactly.
is a very American thing to say, but like, I wonder if that's part of what gets people into trouble, is that they're just trying to not do the hard work.
I think you've hit it, the nail on the head with that one. And then also, I think it's important to look at mental illness when it comes to all of this too. I mean, I I think people, and we debunked the name India syndrome, but the actual syndrome is real. There's this cultural shock, this culture shock that happens when you go to these countries, and there's travel, like just that long, extensive travel that you're still trying to sort of like come down from when you get to these countries. And sometimes that can spin people, it can sort of shake people, and things show up. And so I think it's important to look at mental illness as well when it comes to this, because some of that stuff can sort of appear when your body's shocked.
So what is, whether it's real or caused by something else, what is India syndrome?
Well, it's defined by this guy. His name is Regis Arro, and he's this French psychiatrist. And it was defined as a psychosis that hits people from developed Western countries who are looking for a cultural space that is pure and exotic, where real values have been preserved. So, when we talked to a psychiatrist in Delhi, he was like, I've never heard of that term. It's not used frequently here. It was something that he saw as like media eye candy to sort of, yeah. But he did say the psychosis is very real, and he sees it with culture shock, travel. And then, people can meditate too quickly, and it can be too intense, too fast. And that can also lead to sort of this psychosis too. It's interesting. We interviewed this guy who was in Rishikesh, India, with the Beatles when they were there seeking enlightenment with the Maharishi. And the Maharishi called it icebergs that you would hit. So this is sort of places in your subconscious where you would hit trauma. And he believed it was from this life or past life. And this is pretty cool. Well, I think it's interesting because I'm obsessed with the Beatles, but John Lennon hit an iceberg when he was with the Maharishi. And what you're supposed to do when that happens, when you hit this trauma, is you're supposed to work with a vetted practitioner through this. And the Maharishi was there to help John Lennon work through it. But it also is terrifying. And some people stay there. And he was like, he bolted when it happened. He's like, I don't want to work through this. I don't want to. And he just left. And Ricky, a cook who we interviewed, who's actually Bungalow Bill, John Lennon wrote a song about him in the White Album. He said that when John Lennon bolted, he stayed in that place of trauma. And that was the year that his marriage broke up. The Beatles ended up breaking up. That was the year after. When he was sort of still living in this. And he says that it was detrimental. I mean, that was Ricky's own point of view. I don't know my thoughts on that, but I thought that was interesting because you can hit this trauma if you do meditate too quickly and too intensely, and you don't have that sort of, it's like we were saying, it's a fast track to enlightenment, but you have to build the muscle. It's not just something that can happen overnight. And the Maharishi really noticed that.
Yeah, and oh gosh, I keep coming back to like this is a very American thing. Or at least from my perspective, very Western. I want it now, but then when the going gets tough,
yeah,
I don't want to deal with it, and that kind of makes sense to me. Of like, if you're going somewhere that you've been on a plane, there's culture shock, there's the jet lag. You're dealing with emotional issues that you've maybe never tried to deal with. That it just puts people in a very potentially very fragile state.
I agree. I think that you're right. And also like with India, factor in the dehydration, the food, like all of that stuff. And it can put you in a fragile state. And that's why I think having either a touch base there or a buddy with you, having someone you can call at home to tell them where you're going, like that's all very important. I think that you have to be careful about who you end up sort of looking for spiritual enlightenment from wherever you go as well. And Susie Singh, the therapist, also said, as women or men, going to be with a guru one-on-one is not the best idea. So just also making sure that you're aware of what, you're drinking and eating, maybe bringing your own water. I hate to be so overly cautious, but just sort of dealing with these issues in Astray, I am more cautious now when it comes to this and not being completely trusting of someone just because they are, quote unquote, a spiritual guide.
That's so funny because that hits again on another one of those common traits of scams is this aspect of authority.
Mm-hmm.
That they're, whether that person truly is an authority or not, they're a perceived authority. And so we tend to let our guard down, assume that they're the expert, and we kind of stop doing the due diligence that we might otherwise do if it were somebody else.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So is there, like, I'm thinking, like, is there a good way for people to do like if they're interested in a particular type of enlightenment? I'm being intentionally vague here. That there's like a primer, so to speak, that they can do. Like, are there, you talked about, like, not sitting down in one-on-one with the authority figure, but as more of a group. Are there programs that are more like class oriented with groups that are kind of like introduction to enlightenment?
Oh my gosh.
Even if it's like, let's say if it's even a particular, teaching, is to, rather than to let's dive into ice cold water, let's work our way into this and see if this is really what you want to be doing in a setting where it's not being fast tracked.
Well, I think, enlightenment, first of all, is different for everyone. That idea of enlightenment is such an enigma. But I think, depending on what that enlightenment is for you, they always have group classes. They always have, even for Tony Robbins stuff, who a lot of people find quote unquote enlightenment in. You can go to sort of introductory courses, group situations and sort of feel it out. And I think being able to trust your inner voice and your own intuition in those situations is key. I think what happens is we begin to look outside ourselves for those answers, and then we don't trust our inner guidance, which is something that, to your point about the Western sort of culture, we've a lot of us have forgotten how to even listen to it. And, I think meditation and this idea of meditation, these people that I'm speaking of were doing meditation to sort of to reach this higher plane. If you're using meditation to listen to yourself and to actually hear your own inner voice, that's different. So I think being able to sit with yourself is important. And in these group settings, be it with a guru or be it with this yoga ashram, and being able to ask the right questions and vet those places as well, I think is very key.
So how, like, not knowing about yogis and sadhus and whatnot, how would someone go about vetting someone like that?
Well, it's tricky because if you're going to India and you don't, it's just some guy this sadhu that you've heard about who can take you on this enlightenment journey, like, people, you can't really vet that, which is why it can be dangerous. But I think for, someone in the States, you can always, there are ways to, sort of figure out who their followers are, or I hate to say the word followers, that's sort of like a guru.
They're students.
Yeah, students. But you can always find people that have been involved in that, or usually these are organizations, and you can call and sort of interview them. And look, everyone has a Yelp page now.
Yeah.
I mean, even for Astray, it's like their reviews, like, just read the reviews and, but, yeah, so.
So like you say, it's a multi-billion-dollar a year industry. So is this like the yogis charging people to visit them? And, if you want to learn from me, you have to pay me this amount of money?
Oh my gosh. Have you never been part of this whole world at all, the spiritual world?
Not in the sense of I'm paying for enlightenment.
Oh, dude, it's a huge thing. It's like you pay psychics, you pay, for these yoga ashram things. You have like these talks, these huge, like I said, Tony Robbins, like these speakers, like people pay thousands of dollars for clarity in their life, for purpose, for identity. And we look to these people to answer this for us. Tell me who I am.
Yeah.
But and I'll pay you thousands of dollars for it. And that's, for me, it feels I don't like it. I wish that, like, therapy now has regulations. I wish that there are regulations. I wish the spiritual industry was regulated. I think that needs to happen. There was a podcast called Guru that was out, and it was about this guy. I can't remember his name, but he was like this sort of Tony Robbins type guy. And people came to him because they thought he had the answers. And he eventually ended up getting everyone into this big, I can't remember what it's called now, but it's like this, the Native Americans use it. It's a sweat lodge.
Yeah.
And he had them in there, and he ended up, there were like 4 people that died during this.
Oh, I think I remember this.
Yeah. He said he was basically testing their strength, their will as humans, and they died. And I spoke to one of the mothers of one of the women who died, and she said the people that had buddies, that had someone else that went with them on this workshop weekend, they're the ones who left. They're the ones who left this sweat lodge, and the ones that didn't were alone. And there's something in that. So I think sort of having that voice of reason, or just someone to sort of bounce this off of, is key. During the times of my life where I've sought some sort of answer outside of myself and it might be a little trippy, I'll always run it by my most skeptical friend or my mom. And then when she's sort of like, okay, then I'm like, okay, let me rethink this. Am I doing this because it's really going to help me, or do I want to have a quick fix and a quick answer to my life right now?
Yeah, that's funny, because that's one of those other key things with scams, of like bouncing the results off of other people. Does this seem reasonable to you?
Yeah. You have to. I think having that voice of reason is very key, because we get lost in sort of the idea of it, right?
Yeah. We get lost in the excitement and the passion of it. And sometimes it says, well, sometimes it's well placed, and sometimes it's a passion running towards a cliff, and you don't have that bungee cord.
Exactly. I also think too, and I don't know if you do this, but I get really excited about something. Like, I'll be like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then if I sleep on it the next morning, I'm like, oh, that was just this quick fix thing that I have, where I'm like, this person's going to solve everything, or. And so I think just even being able to give it some space and time and seeing if it still has the same effect.
Yep.
A night later or a week later.
That is a huge rule of thumb for me, is no big decisions get made in the moment.
Right.
It's always, if it truly is of value, it will be just as much of the same value tomorrow as it was today.
That's such a good point. And I have a friend who, whenever this is a little dramatic, but if someone dies in her life, like someone she's really, like her father just passed, she doesn't make any big decisions that entire year, because she knows she's sort of living in a place of that sort of rock bottom.
Yeah, I've definitely heard the advice of, don't make major decisions when sudden things have happened to you, whether it's you were involved in a natural disaster or in a car accident, someone passed away, that like, while you're working through all those things, that's not the right time to buy a new house. It's not the right time to change your job. It's not the right time to get married or get a divorce. Like, there's so much other stuff going on in your mental and spiritual space that you just need to let those things settle down. That way you're making a wise decision, as opposed to something that's kind of emotional and feels right in the moment when things are topsy-turvy.
Right. That impulsive decision. Yeah. And I think that's what I really realized with doing Astray, is that people really are seeking more when they are in those rock bottom places. And, I think it's just continuing to check in with yourself and make sure that you're not, when you're giving your power away. It always feels like an off dynamic. And I think people choose to ignore it. So I think just being aware of that.
Yeah. And honestly, I think in some cases I could think of times in my life where I kind of wanted to give that power away. I didn't want to be the one who had to make the decision. I wanted to, you figure it out for me and then just let me know.
I totally feel you. I've done the same thing. But as I've become more of an adult,
Mm-hmm.
I've realized that it's really my responsibility to do that. But look, I mean, it's weird too. Like, I used to be a big psychic person. Like, I used to love going to psychics and energy healers before doing Astray. And since doing Astray, I've been a little more skeptical. But also I've realized that enlightenment is really just being present in the moment. And that's as close as you're going to get.
I like that. Enlightenment is being present in the moment.
It's true. Like that guy, Ricky Cook, that I told you about, who was with the Beatles. Like he studied with the Maharishi for decades. And he said that that's what he learned through all of this. He was a seeker. And then he realized, I don't need to be seeking anything outside myself. It's all in me. It's just being present here.
Yeah. You don't have to go seek something. It's already here. You just need to see it.
It's true. It's true.
So I'm wondering, in your research for this, and you even kind of talk about it in the promo for your podcast, is, you know, people disappearing without a trace and people ending up dead. Is this just a person here or there, or is it a larger issue?
Well, we were trying to sort of trace it to something that might be larger, you know, like maybe it was a guru that was sort of in Rishikesh doing this. But honestly, no, it's not. It's a handful of people that have created more of a narrative around this. Unfortunately, these are tragic stories, and the families that are still dealing with the grief, I can't even imagine what they're going through. And, you know, I was very lucky that they trusted me with their children's stories. But
Yeah.
it was a handful of situations. They were very tragic. And unfortunately, from when I first found out about this, the media made it seem like it was much bigger than it actually was. And no, India is not a Venus flytrap for your vulnerability.
Yeah. They're not taking in hundreds of millions of people from all around the world and vanishing them.
Right. And I will say too, like I got called out a lot with doing this around India, and sort of people thought I was demonizing India. And it really, and that's what I boil it down to at the end. It's not India syndrome, it's seeker syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
It's this could happen anywhere. So yeah, I think I really want to have be very, very direct about that and bring awareness to that.
And I think you very well could reverse it. And, you know, how many people have come from other countries to the U.S., you know, they're seeking power, they're seeking rich, they're seeking the American dream, and get caught up in, you know, drug addiction, mental health issues,
Sure.
You know, getting taken advantage of by some, you know, some horrible business owner, you know. So it's, I don't know that this doesn't just point one way. I mean, this particular discussion is on the context of enlightenment, but if you switch it around and seeker syndrome, it's not just necessarily enlightenment. It could be seeking financial gain.
Yeah.
Is going to have the same risks associated with it.
Yeah. I think anytime that you're seeking in general, you have to ask yourself why. And at what, you know, and what I was really looking at with the cost of enlightenment is, what do we sacrifice for this risk? What do we sacrifice for, in this case, enlightenment?
Mm-hmm.
In the case that you made, this sort of financial, you know, goal or whatever. What do you sacrifice for that?
Yeah, that's it's kind of scary. I mean, it's just the thought. I mean, to me, you know, anytime I've traveled overseas, it's always been with people, because like I don't want to be somewhere alone and not knowing, you know, how to get help if I need it.
Yeah. I traveled alone when I was like to Bali specifically. And I remember just being so trusting, and I'd read Eat, Pray, Love. So I was like, I think Bali's fine, you know, but I do think I wish I'd had a little bit more awareness around it. I did do my due diligence and I vetted the places I was going and all of that. But, you know, I just want people to be safe. And I know it's like such a bummer, because you just want to go places and trust your experience, right? But I think that there always needs to be an awareness around travel in general.
Yeah. I mean, the further you are from home, the further the culture is different from your own, the further the languages are from your own, that those things in and of themselves are not bad or dangerous.
No.
It's just or they're not the cause of the danger, but there's always going to be people that are going to look to take advantage of people, whether they're domestic or foreign. And once you have a language barrier, cultural barrier, a distance barrier, you're just a little bit more of a target.
Yeah. And I also think, oh my gosh, travel is the best for a change of perspective. I mean, to be able to travel gives you so much, it just opens things up. So I really believe in travel. But to your point, yes, there are a lot of people that are preying on the new, this new person who's in this new country. And, but I don't know. I'd like to believe that I have a better gut instinct now, towards that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's part of growing up, and I'm sure the podcast has kind of heightened a bit of those senses as well.
Oh my gosh, yeah, totally.
So if people want to listen to your podcast, where can they find it, and where can they find you online?
So my podcast is on all of the platforms, the podcast platforms, and online, I'm at carolineslaughter.com. I'm at cslaughters on Instagram. And I do not do the Twitter or Facebook thing. I'm probably on there, but I don't really engage.
You don't need to. It's not a requirement these days.
Yeah, it's true.
And what is the full title of the podcast?
It's called Astray. Yeah, that's it. It's a simple title for a very complicated subject.
Yes. Do you have a website dedicated to the podcast?
We don't. We just have, if you want to talk about the podcast, you can go onto my website, carolineslaughter.com, and you can hit me up there.
Awesome. I'm sure there are people that have questions.
Oh my gosh, I still have questions. Like, the thing is, you interview a lot of experts, and I am a seeker myself, and I did this podcast to explore this idea of enlightenment further. So I'm still sort of figuring out my own questions around it. And I think that will always be. It's a process, right? Well,
I think that's what enlightenment is. I mean, it's not I don't think it's a process that stops. You've arrived.
No.
The danger of any. I think of that in terms of Christianity. If you think you've arrived, you've got another story in store for you.
Yeah.
Anytime you think that, I've done the work, I'm done, I'm finished, I don't need to work on myself, I don't need more insights. I think that's where we get ourselves in trouble from that perspective.
Yeah, and something else always shows up.
Yes, it does. Doesn't it? Caroline, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Pray podcast today.
Thank you, Chris, for having me. It was great to sort of talk about this and process it with you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Easy Pray podcast. If you found something memorable or actionable about this episode, please leave a comment as a review at easypray.com/review. Notes and a transcript of this episode with Caroline Slaughter can be found at easypray.com/73.